Cassidy Gray had always believed that the universe was conspiring against her. Maybe it was the piles of paperwork at her dead-end office job, the unflattering fluorescent lights that flickered above her desk, or the monotonous ticking of the clock that seemed to echo every minute of her life. But today? Today was different. Today, she discovered a new level of cosmic frustration. She sat in her cubicle at the Callaway Insurance Agency, sipping her lukewarm coffee with a look of quiet resignation. The usual hum of activity around her was comforting in a way, like background noise to a scene in a boring movie. A few feet away, Greg from accounting was muttering about the budget reports for the third time this week. Across the aisle, Martha from HR was whispering into her phone, no doubt preparing for another round of passive-aggressive office drama. Cassidy took another sip. If this coffee tastes any more like burnt socks, I might just start drinking it straight from the pot, she muttered under her breath, but no one cared enough to respond. It was the kind of day where even your sarcasm felt tired. Her phone buzzed. A reminder, Zoom meeting in 10 minutes. She sighed. Oh great, another one of these. Cassidy had never understood the appeal of Zoom meetings. They were like listening to a bad podcast where everyone talked but no one actually said anything useful. She glanced at the clock. It was 9:55 a.m. The perfect time to sprint to the break room, fill her cup with something that might at least pass as a better version of coffee, and avoid getting caught up in yet another pointless virtual powwow. But as she stood up, something strange happened. It was subtle at first, like a gentle ripple through the air. Cassidy paused, scanning her surroundings, but the office seemed as ordinary as ever. She started to walk toward the break room, but then, bam, the world flickered. 1 second, she was walking down the aisle of cubicles, passing the printer that always seemed to be out of paper, and the next, everything was different. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, as if someone had turned up the volume on the noise. But more than that, the entire space seemed off. The layout of the office was subtly altered, like the walls were breathing in and out, expanding and contracting in slow waves. The clock on the wall, which had been steadfastly showing 9:56 a.m., now blinked to 9:53 and then jumped to 9:58. Cassidy froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Did anyone else see that? She muttered to herself, but no one responded. Greg from accounting was still yammering about numbers, and Martha from HR was still chatting away on her phone. No one had noticed the time shift. No one but her. She took a cautious step forward. What the hell just happened? She looked around again, feeling like something was horribly wrong. The world, her world, seemed to have warped, like a bad visual effect from an old science fiction movie. And then, the clock blinked again. This time, it flashed to 9:59, skipped ahead to 10:01, and then, in a horrifying moment of déjà vu, rewound to 9:55. What the hell? Cassidy muttered, feeling her pulse spike. Am I losing my mind? A flash of light, bright and sudden, exploded in front of her. Cassidy yelped and staggered backward, crashing into her desk. The entire office was in motion, like someone had pressed the fast-forward button on reality. Time was skipping, jumping, blurring into itself. For a split second, she saw Greg's head snap back, his body frozen mid-sentence, and then, just as suddenly, he was back to talking, the words coming out of his mouth as though they'd never stopped. What the actual? Cassidy looked around, wide-eyed. Something was definitely wrong. But it wasn't just the office. It was her. A voice, quiet at first, barely a whisper, appeared in her mind. You have the power to control time, Cassidy. She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the voice. Great, now I'm hearing voices too. But the voice persisted. Time is broken. And you, it hesitated, you are the cause. Wait, what? Cassidy's voice was barely above a whisper now. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of her desk for stability, trying to make sense of what was happening. No. No, I'm not some kind of freak who controls time. Another flicker of light, and she was yanked forward, her entire body moving without her consent. She stumbled into the hallway, her feet unsteady, like she was walking in slow motion. Or was it fast motion? Everything felt out of sync. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of someone standing at the far end of the corridor, tall, sharply dressed, and with an air of authority that made him seem like he didn't belong in an insurance office. The man tilted his head as if he'd been expecting her. Cassidy's first instinct was to bolt. But her feet remained frozen to the floor. There was something unnerving about him, something that didn't belong in this world. Cassidy Gray, the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm for the situation. You've been chosen. She stared at him, trying to process his words. Chosen for what? You, who the hell are you? He took a step closer, his presence radiating an unsettling calmness. Lucius, he said simply, as though his name alone was supposed to explain everything. Cassidy narrowed her eyes, still half wondering if she'd fallen into some kind of bizarre dream. Lucius? Really? Are we doing biblical names now? Lucius smiled slightly, not bothered by her sarcasm. Your world is about to change, Cassidy. And you are about to play a central role in that change. You're not crazy. And you're not imagining things. His eyes flickered to the time on the clock as it jumped again, 8:43, 9:12, 9:59. You have the ability to perceive and manipulate time. You just don't understand it yet. Cassidy blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Time? Perceive and manipulate time? Her head spun. I don't even know how to fix a jammed printer, let alone control time. She gave him an incredulous look. Are you telling me this is all my fault? Not your fault, Lucius said softly. You were chosen. For a reason. You're part of something much bigger than you realize. Before she could respond, another strange sensation washed over her. The world flickered again, just as she thought she was starting to catch her bearings. Time warped, and in the blink of an eye, everything shifted again. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Cassidy found herself back in her cubicle. The office around her was perfectly normal, no signs of flickering clocks or distorted space. Time was running in the usual, expected flow. Cassidy, Lucius's voice echoed in her ear, though he was nowhere to be seen. You have to come with me. It's already too late. Cassidy blinked. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. The flickering lights, the warped office space, and the man, Lucius, had all disappeared, leaving her alone in her cubicle. She sat up straighter, taking in the normalcy of her surroundings. The printer hummed in the corner. Greg was still talking about budget reports. Martha was still on the phone, whispering to someone who definitely wasn't listening. The clock on the wall read 10:10 a.m., a perfectly average time for a Wednesday morning, and yet, something felt off. Her hand hovered over her coffee cup. The liquid inside was cold now, untouched. She hadn't even taken a sip since the madness had started. Her fingers twitched, an unfamiliar restlessness taking over her. Her heart still raced from the strange encounter with Lucius, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her wasn't quite the same. Get a grip, Cassidy, she muttered under her breath, rubbing her eyes. It's just stress. It's been a long day. But the words felt hollow, like she was trying to convince herself of something she didn't believe. She'd spent her whole life trying to ignore the oddities, the things that didn't quite fit, and now, well, now they had shattered her entire understanding of reality. The office remained quiet. Cassidy glanced at the clock again. 10:10, her mind couldn't settle. She rubbed the back of her neck, wishing she could shake off the nagging sense of wrongness. Suddenly, the voice came again. Clearer this time. Louder. You're not imagining things. Time is breaking. You have to help fix it. Cassidy froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of her neck. She looked around the office, her eyes darting from Greg to Martha, as if expecting them to hear it too. They didn't seem to notice. No one else had reacted. "You're not real," she muttered, gripping the edge of her desk as if it could ground her. "This is just some weird stress-induced hallucination." "It's not. We are real, Cassidy." "Stop," she said, her voice tight. She slammed her palm against the desk, making Greg glance up briefly. His eyes flickered over her before returning to whatever spreadsheet was currently holding his attention. Cassidy closed her eyes, willing the voice away. But it lingered, faint, like a breeze stirring the air around her. "You have to fix it. You can't run from this." She shook her head, willing herself to stay in the present. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The office bell rang, signaling the start of the Zoom meeting. Cassidy let out a long sigh, pulling herself to her feet with a sharp, exaggerated motion. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of the meeting or the persistent, unsettling voice in her head. She grabbed her coffee and moved toward the break room. It was time for some caffeine, maybe a snack, and, if she was lucky, 5 minutes of peace before her world unraveled again. As she stepped into the small, dimly lit break room, Cassidy allowed herself a moment of quiet. The walls here were lined with old motivational posters. "Teamwork makes the dream work," one read. She reached for a half-full box of stale crackers and tore open the package. As she did, she felt the world shift again, another subtle ripple, like the air itself was stretching. A chill ran down her spine. Her hand froze, crackers in midair, as something flickered at the edge of her vision. The moment passed, but Cassidy was sure it had happened. All right," she muttered, tossing the crackers onto the counter. "This is it. This is where I lose my mind." She wasn't sure if she was talking about the job, the voice in her head, or both. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them, Lucius stood in front of her, as if he'd materialized out of thin air. "Enough with the theatrics," she snapped, her voice tight with frustration. "I'm done with whatever this is. I just want a normal day. Just give me a damn break." Lucius didn't seem fazed. He just stood there, eyes locked on hers, his expression unreadable. "I understand you're confused, Cassidy. But you don't have a choice anymore. You've been pulled into something much bigger than your office job." Cassidy scowled. "I didn't sign up for this. I don't know what the hell you want from me, but I'm not some superhero who fixes time or whatever it is you think I am." He smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't have to sign up for anything. You've already been chosen." She stepped back, shaking her head. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm just a regular." "You're not," he interrupted, stepping closer. His tone softened, but only slightly. "You're not a regular person, Cassidy. Time doesn't work the way you think it does. You've been chosen because you have the ability to manipulate it." Cassidy blinked. This had to be a joke. This was some weird hallucination, right? She opened her mouth to argue, but her throat went dry. She had no words. None that seemed to make sense in the situation she found herself in. Lucius tilted his head. "You were born with the power to see time in a way no one else can. You can manipulate it, bend it to your will, though you don't fully understand it yet. That's why the ripples are happening. That's why you can feel the world bending." "No," Cassidy said, her voice cracking. I'm just a person. A person who works at an insurance office, who drinks too much coffee, who just wants things to stop being weird." "Time isn't something that just stops, Cassidy," Lucius said softly. "And you can't pretend it doesn't matter anymore. What you do, what you can do, will affect the entire timeline. All of it. The world you know, it's unraveling." Cassidy's mind was spinning, her thoughts fragmented. The clock on the wall blinked again, 10:22, then jumped to 9:47. The world wavered as though it were underwater. Lucius stepped forward. "You're not imagining it. You've been caught in a battle you didn't choose. But you are part of it. Whether you like it or not." "I don't," Cassidy trailed off, her thoughts scattered like confetti in the wind. There was no escape from this, no way to turn back. The world around her continued to flicker, and she was helpless to stop it. A new voice, the voice she'd heard in her head earlier, spoke again. "The architects are coming. You have to choose. Help us, or the timeline will shatter beyond repair." Cassidy gripped the edge of the counter, fighting the dizziness. "Architects?" she thought, her pulse pounding in her ears. But the voice didn't respond. Lucius was still there, waiting, his eyes unwavering. "You're not crazy. But you do have to decide, Cassidy. Will you help us fix time? Or will you stand aside while everything you know disappears?" Cassidy's stomach twisted. She had no answers, only questions. But one thing was clear, there was no going back. Lucius stepped closer, his gaze intense. "The choice is yours. But you're running out of time." Cassidy's fingers tightened around the counter. The room around her swirled, and she felt the pull of something greater, something larger than herself. Time was no longer just a ticking clock. Time was a battleground, and she was the weapon. She couldn't escape it. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't supposed to. Cassidy stood there, her mind swirling, her body locked in place by an invisible force. The hum of the fluorescent lights above her seemed to get louder, almost deafening. Time was ticking, but it felt like everything around her had slowed down. She looked at Lucius, the man who had appeared from nowhere and seemed to know more about her than she did herself. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and that unsettling calm of his made Cassidy's skin prickle. He was waiting for her to answer, to make a decision that felt far beyond her comprehension, but how could she make a decision? Everything she knew about the world, her job, her life, her reality, was being ripped apart, piece by piece. Time itself was a battlefield, and she was the weapon. She didn't ask for this. Hell, she hadn't even known it was possible. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about," she said, her voice unsteady, but she didn't break her gaze from his. "You want me to fix time? That doesn't even make sense." Lucius's lips twitched into a thin smile. "It doesn't have to make sense right now. What matters is that you understand the consequences of inaction. If you do nothing, time will continue to unravel. The ripples will become waves. History will collapse in on itself, and the world as you know it will cease to exist." Her breath hitched. History, collapse? She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but the weight of his words was too heavy. "This is all so insane." "No," Lucius replied, his voice soft yet firm. "It's reality, Cassidy. And it's already happening." The air around her seemed to thrum with an energy she couldn't explain, as if time itself were vibrating, stretched thin across the universe, waiting for a force, someone, to hold it steady. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just about fixing small mistakes, small regrets. This wasn't about preventing a bad day or reversing a broken coffee machine. No, this was about controlling the flow of the entire universe, the past, the present, the future. The idea of holding that kind of power was overwhelming. Terrifying, but at the same time, something inside her stirred, a sense of rightness, as if the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she was solving were suddenly snapping together. She was the one who could control it. She had the power. It was inside her. And deep down, Cassidy knew there was no running away from it. She wasn't just a regular office worker, a cog in the corporate machine. She was something more. Chosen, Lucius had said. But chosen for what? She couldn't ignore it anymore. "All right," Cassidy finally said, her voice rough with the weight of her decision. "Say I believe you. Say I believe this is real. What exactly do you want me to do? Lucius stepped closer, his expression serious. You've already done something, whether you realize it or not. You've created the fractures, the disruptions, the ripples. But you didn't know what they meant. You didn't understand the power you had. Now, you need to learn how to control it, before it's too late. Cassidy frowned. And how do I do that? You don't exactly make a habit of explaining things, Lucius. He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. We don't have much time. But I'll teach you. I'll show you how to wield your power. Time is like a river. It can be shaped, redirected, even paused. But every change, every shift, comes at a cost. Her chest tightened. What kind of cost? The more you manipulate time, the more fragile it becomes. The fabric of reality will weaken. If you push too far, too fast, you risk collapsing the timeline altogether. Cassidy's stomach turned. So, no pressure, right? Lucius's gaze didn't waver. The fate of time itself depends on your choices. If you fail, the universe as we know it will cease to exist. The world will be trapped in a never-ending loop of chaos. There's no going back. Her mind reeled. The weight of his words settled like a stone in her chest. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think straight. And then she felt it, a shift in the air, a change, like a gust of wind blowing through her, but there was no wind. It was the world around her, warping again. The clock blinked from 10:35 to 10:40 to 10:42, as though someone was skipping ahead, changing the numbers without her consent. Lucius stepped back, his eyes watching her closely. You feel that? That's the ripple. A shift in the timeline. Cassidy gritted her teeth. And you want me to fix it? How? You have the power to set things right, Lucius said. But only you can choose how to use it. She didn't have a clear answer, but something inside her urged her forward, pushed her to do something. Something. What happens if I don't do anything? She asked, trying to steady her voice, though it shook slightly. The ripples will keep growing, Lucius said softly, his tone almost apologetic. Soon, it won't just be time that's broken. The very fabric of reality will unravel. Things will slip between the cracks. People, places, events, they'll be lost to the void. Cassidy shuddered at the thought. She couldn't let that happen. Not if she had the power to stop it. I'll help, she said, the words slipping out before she could fully process them. I don't know how, but I'll do what I can. Lucius nodded once, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. Good. Time is not something you can control easily. But you will learn. I'll teach you. But be prepared. The more you do, the more you'll feel the weight of it. It won't be easy. And you will be forced to make choices you can't unmake. The words hung heavy between them, but Cassidy didn't back down. If she was going to be pulled into this, she was going to do everything she could to protect the world she knew. Where do we start? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Lucius's eyes gleamed. First, you need to understand how to focus your power. Time isn't just about seeing the past or future, it's about understanding the patterns, the flow. You've already started to feel it, haven't you? The ripples. Cassidy closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the sensation inside her. It was strange, like a pulse in her chest, a rhythm that didn't match the normal ticking of the clock. She felt it, a faint hum beneath her skin. Yeah, she said slowly. I feel it. Lucius's voice softened. That's where you start. Focus on the ripples. They're a sign that you can shift the flow. You just need to learn how to direct them. Start small. A few seconds. A minute, maybe. She nodded, even though she wasn't sure she understood any of it. Okay. I'll try. Lucius stepped back. You're not going to succeed immediately. It's a process. But you're already more attuned to it than most people could ever hope to be. Cassidy closed her eyes again, trying to still the rush of thoughts in her head. It was a strange, impossible thing to wrap her mind around, but something inside her told her that this power, wasn't a mistake. It was real. And it was hers. For better or worse, she had to learn to control it. She focused on the pulse inside her, letting it guide her, feeling the ripple grow stronger, sharper, until the world shuddered. The office around her flickered, and for a split second, Cassidy saw what looked like another version of the break room, one that was half buried in shadows, its edges frayed like an old photograph. She gasped and opened her eyes. Lucius was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said quietly. "You've started." But Cassidy wasn't sure whether she felt good about it. Because now that she had touched the ripples, there was no turning back.